She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times on the long journey west. The nervous smile, the careful handshake, the awkward silence of two strangers learning each other's names. What she had never rehearsed was this: the way a man could look at a woman, truly look at her, and then choose in front of everyone to walk away. The train's whistle had barely faded when Warren Dench tore the photograph in half, dropped the pieces at Nora Hale's feet, and turned his back on her without a single word. Not a greeting, not an explanation. Just a dismissal so complete it required no language at all, only the sound of boot heels on sun-bleached planks, and then silence. If you've ever felt invisible in a crowd, like you could disappear and no one would notice, stay with Nora's story. Because what happened next changed everything she thought she knew about belonging. Leave a like and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The dust from the departing train hung in the August heat like a curtain Nora couldn't push through. She stood frozen on the platform of Harlan's Creek, Montana, her single carpet bag resting against her ankle, both halves of her photograph face up on the warped planks at her feet. In one half, her eyes hopeful. In the other, the rest of her discarded. She was 27 years old. She had traveled 19 days from Philadelphia on money she'd borrowed against the last of her mother's silver. She had written 12 letters to a man she'd never met and memorized the return address like a prayer. And now that man was already halfway down the platform steps, his broad back disappearing into the Thursday afternoon crowd without so much as a backward glance. The platform held perhaps 20 people. All of them had seen it. Nora did not cry. That surprised her most of all, that the first thing she felt was not grief, but a strange cottony numbness, as if her body had decided the humiliation was too large to process standing up and had simply postponed it. "Well," the voice came from her left female and bright with satisfaction, "I suppose that settles that." The woman was perhaps 45, dressed in a bottle green bustle gown with too many buttons and a silk fan she deployed with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to performing disapproval. She stood beside the station house as though she'd positioned herself there specifically to witness the spectacle. Later, Nora would learn her name: Reid Calloway, the wife of the town's land assessor, a woman who collected other people's misfortunes, the way some collected pressed flowers carefully for display. "Warren Dench is a particular man," Harriet continued, not speaking to Nora precisely but addressing the remaining onlookers as though Nora were a weather event being narrated rather than a person standing 10 feet away. "He knows his own mind, can't fault him for that. Mail order arrangements are always a gamble, aren't they? Sometimes the photograph simply doesn't match the reality." The words landed like stones on still water, each one sending out rings. Nora felt heat crawl up her neck. She wanted to speak, to say that the photograph had been taken 4 months ago, that she was exactly who she'd claimed to be, in every letter that she had been honest to the point of painful specificity about her background, her skills, her hopes. But her throat had sealed itself around the words, trapping them somewhere between her heart and her mouth. "Harriet." The voice belonged to a man in a shopkeeper's apron, heavy-set 60s with a walrus mustache, and the uncomfortable expression of someone who had been bystander to too many things he wished he could undo. "That's enough." He turned to Nora with genuine sympathy in his eyes, the kind that cost a man something. "Misses their family, we could wire someone back east who could send train fare." Nora shook her head. The motion felt mechanical, like a doll's. "There's no one," she managed. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone standing at the far end of a long corridor. "The boarding house is full," Harriet said, fan snapping shut with a decisive click. "Miners came through last week and took every bed. And a woman traveling alone without connections." She let the implications settle like sediment. "Catherine Crawford won't hire her at the Hotel George. You know that. By supper time, the whole town will know what happened on this platform." George Fenn, for that was his name, Nora would learn, opened his mouth to respond. But something had changed in his face since Harriet's last words, something that hadn't been there a moment before. He glanced toward the street where Warren Dench had gone, and for a half-second his expression flickered with something that wasn't pity at all. Something more like unease. Nora noticed. She filed it away in the part of her mind that was still functioning, the part that had kept her alive through 2 years of being a poor relation in her aunt's Philadelphia household, the part that paid attention to what people didn't say. "What did he tell you?" she asked. George blinked. Beg pardon, Warren Dench. Before he walked away, he stopped and said something to you. I saw it. She hadn't been certain until this moment, but George's face confirmed it. The slight recoil, the averting of the eyes, the way he'd repositioned himself, as though creating physical distance from whatever he had been told. What did he say? The shopkeeper looked away. Miss, I don't think this is the time. George? Her voice was steadier, now anger doing what shock hadn't, clearing the fog, sharpening the edges of everything. I have no money, no lodging, and apparently no prospects in this town. I came 19 days on a train. I have 2 dresses and my mother's Bible in this bag. The least you can do is tell me what was said about me. Harriet Cullen made a small sound of impatience and turned away. She had what she'd come for. The remaining onlookers, sensing the spectacle had reached its resolution, began peeling off toward their ordinary Friday afternoon business, leaving Nora alone with George Fenn and the wreckage of the afternoon. George rubbed the back of his neck with one thick hand. He looked at the planks at the street, at anywhere that wasn't Nora's face. He said, the shopkeeper began, then stopped, swallowed, tried again. He said you'd misrepresented your situation, that there were things in your background in Philadelphia that you hadn't disclosed. He held up both hands quickly. I'm not saying I believe it. I want you to know that. I'm just telling you what he said because you asked. Nora went very still. She thought about the letters she'd written, 12 of them, over 8 months, each one chosen with care. She described her parents' deaths honestly, her circumstances with her aunt honestly, her skills and limitations honestly. She'd included details she'd been embarrassed to include, small humiliations of poverty she'd forced herself to put on paper because she refused to begin any new chapter of her life with deception. If Warren Dench believed she'd misrepresented herself, he was wrong. If he didn't believe it and had said it anyway, that was something else entirely. Something considerably worse. There was nothing in her background. There was nothing to disclose. She had been, if anything, embarrassingly thorough in her self-presentation, the orphaned daughter of a school teacher and a seamstress, 3 years spent as unpaid household help in her aunt's home. No scandal, no shadow, no secrets. The photograph was accurate. The letters were honest. Every word she had written to Warren Dench over 8 months of correspondence had been the plain truth, which meant one of 2 things: either Warren Dench genuinely believed something that wasn't true, or he had invented something that never existed. What exactly did he say I'd done? She asked. George's discomfort intensified. He wasn't specific, just said you hadn't been forthcoming about your past. Miss Truly, the evening train runs at 6, Denver by tomorrow. There's good hotel work there or restaurant work, and I used everything I had to come here. The admission tasted like ash. There's no fare back. The silence that followed had a different quality, heavier, more complicated, weighted with the particular discomfort of witnessing a problem that has no easy solution. And then, from the far end of the platform, came the sound of 2 sets of footsteps, one long and deliberate, the other quick and light as sparrow hops. Reid Calloway moved with the unhurried ground-covering stride of a man who spent his days covering large distances on foot and horseback, who had learned long ago that rushing rarely improved an outcome. He was perhaps 36, though the sun had written additional years on his face, a rancher's face, angular and weathered, with gray eyes set beneath a hat brim that he wore low against the Montana glare. The child beside him was 6 years old, small-boned and dark-haired, her 2 braids bouncing against her shoulders as she skipped to match her father's pace. She had his gray eyes, but not his caution. Hers were wide open to everything, taking in the scene on the platform with frank and uncomplicated curiosity. They reached the platform just as Harriet Cullen departed with a swish of bottle green skirts, her exit somehow more cutting than her presence had been. Reid Calloway stopped, taking in the scene with a single sweep: the woman with the carpet bag, the torn photograph on the planks, George's uncomfortable posture, the atmosphere of witnessed humiliation still hanging in the heavy air. "Afternoon, George," he said. His voice had the roughness of someone who spent more time talking to horses than to people. "Train on time today." "Just left," George said, relief at the interruption visible in every line of his face. "Caleb Reid, yes, it was on time." Reid's gaze had already shifted to Nora. He regarded her the way he might regard a fence that had blown down in a storm, not without sympathy, but practically assessing what the situation required. "Papa!" The child peered around her father's leg and studied Nora with the solemn intensity of the very young. Is that lady going to cry? Lily. The name was gentle but firm. Lily subsided, but she kept looking. Nora realized with a start that her eyes had filled with tears she hadn't consciously summoned. She blinked them back and looked at the planks beneath her feet. I should be going, she said to no one in particular. The afternoon was still bright and punishing, and she had no idea where she intended to go. The main street of Harlan's Creek, visible beyond the platform, offered no obvious sanctuary, a general store, a saloon buildings she couldn't identify at this distance. Just a moment, Reid's voice stopped her without being loud. He turned to George. What's the situation? George explained in low tones, though Nora could hear every word. The mail order arrangement, the rejection, the lack of funds or prospects. What Warren Dench had said before he walked away. As George spoke, Reid's expression remained largely unchanged, but something shifted in the set of his jaw, a slight tightening that suggested an emotion he was choosing not to display. Garrett did this, Reid asked when George had finished. Warren Dench, Nora said quietly. His name is Warren Dench. I know his name. Something cold moved through Reid's gray eyes. He left you stranded. It wasn't a question. George made a small sound of protest, something about Warren having the right to refuse the arrangement, and Reid looked at him with the particular patience of a man who does not intend to argue. He left a woman on a train platform with no money and nowhere to go, Reid said. Whatever his rights were, that's what he did. He turned back to Nora. You have skills. The question was so abrupt that Nora blinked. Yes, I kept house for my aunt and her family. 7 people. I can cook clean, manage a kitchen and a garden. I've tended chickens, done mending and preserving. Reid looked at her steadily. I have a ranch, 5 miles south, cattle and horses in a vegetable garden that's mostly dying because I can't tend it properly, and alongside everyone else, a pause. My wife passed 2 years ago. I've been managing poorly. He said it the way a man reports the weather factual, without self-pity, simply stating the shape of things. I need help. You need a place to be. I'm proposing an arrangement room and board in exchange for honest work until you've figured out what comes next. Temporary. Nothing more or less than that. Another pause shorter. That agreeable to you? Nora's mind was still working to catch up with the speed at which her life was changing. An hour ago, she had been a woman about to become someone's wife. Now she was standing on a sun-bleached platform considering the offer of a stranger she had met 30 seconds ago. But there was a dignity in what he was proposing that pure charity would have lacked. He wasn't offering her pity. He was offering work. I'd earn my keep, she said. I wouldn't be a burden. Didn't figure you would be. Something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. I won't pretend it's easy living. The work is constant. The house needs everything. And he glanced down at Lily, who was still watching Nora with those solemn gray eyes. My daughter needs things I don't know how to give her. Lily stepped forward, then not dramatically, not with any apparent awareness that she was doing something significant. She simply slipped her small hand into Nora's, the way a child reaches for something that seems like it might be useful or safe. The gesture cracked something open in Nora's chest. Is the lady coming home with us, Papa? Lily asked. That's up to the lady, little bird. They both looked at her, the taciturn rancher and his watchful daughter, and Nora understood that this was the moment, that everything which came after would hinge on what she said in the next 10 seconds. She could refuse. She could insist on waiting for some cleaner solution, some outcome that didn't require following a stranger to an isolated ranch. She could cling to the idea of dignity. Or she could acknowledge that pride was a luxury she had already spent. I'll come, she said, and I'll earn my keep. I promise you that. Reid nodded once as if they'd concluded a business transaction. Wagon's just down the street. We'll get you settled before dark. As they walked away from the platform, George called something after them, something about propriety, about the impropriety of the arrangement, about what people would say. His voice faded as they moved into the street, and Nora let it fade, concentrating instead on the small, warm hands still clasped in hers and on putting one foot in front of the other. The wagon was exactly what she'd expected, solid, worn, built for work. Reid lifted Lily into the back with easy strength, then turned to help Nora up. His hands at her waist were brief in impersonal contact, as functional as a handshake. But even that small touch felt strange after months of being treated like a ghost in her aunt's house. "Thank you," she said as she settled onto the bench, "for not leaving me there." Reid climbed up beside her and gathered the reins. "A man who'd leave a woman stranded isn't a man worth knowing." He clicked to the horses. "Dench just showed everyone what he's made of." They pulled away from town as the afternoon painted everything in amber. Lily settled in the wagon bed with her knees pulled up and her braids falling forward, began to talk about the horses at the ranch, about a mare named Clover, who was particularly gentle about the chickens and their personalities, about a coyote that had been testing the fence line, and the way her papa chased it off with a lantern. Nora listened, grateful for the sound of a human voice that asked nothing of her. Reid drove in silence, but she sensed he was listening to his daughter, tracking each word with careful attention, the way a man listens when he's afraid of missing something important. "We had a housekeeper for a while," Lily announced suddenly, "Mrs. Patton, but she left because she said Papa was too quiet and the ranch was too lonely." "Lily," the familiar gentle warning. "It's true, Papa. She said so." Lily leaned forward between them. "Are you going to leave too?" The question was nakedly honest in the way only a child's questions could be. No guile in it, no strategy, just the stripped-down fear of someone who had already lost the person they loved most. "I don't know what the future holds," Nora said, choosing her words with care. "But I'm here now, and I'll work as hard as I can for as long as I stay." Lily considered this with the gravity of a small judge. Then she nodded once and settled back against the wagon side, apparently satisfied. They traveled in silence for a long stretch. The land rolled away on both sides in waves of dry grass, sage-scented and golden in the declining light, the mountains to the west, rearing up in sharp silhouettes against a sky going slowly orange. It was the biggest country Nora had ever seen. The biggest ski. In Philadelphia, there had always been buildings cutting the horizon into manageable pieces. Here there was nothing to interrupt the view from earth to sky, and the sheer scale of it was almost dizzyingly beautiful in its indifference to human concerns. A woman could disappear in a landscape like this, she thought. Not as a dark thought, almost the opposite. She could disappear, and when she reappeared, she could be whatever she chose. After a while, Reid spoke again. "You'll have your own room," he said. He said it to the road ahead, his voice carrying the slight roughness of someone unused to extended speech. "Used to be storage. It's not much, a bed, a window. You'll take meals with us. Work sunrise to sundown most days. Sundays off except for essential chores. That's more than fair. It's what's right." A pause. "I won't have anyone saying I took advantage of the situation." Nora looked at his profile, the set of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins with the relaxed authority of a man who'd been doing this since childhood. There was something in him that reminded her of certain trees she'd seen, not the ones that grew tall and strayed in sheltered places, but the ones that grew in exposed ground, bent by years of weather, into permanent lean but unbroken. Something in the grain of him that had been tested and hadn't given. "About what happened back there," he said. "What Dench did." His jaw worked. "It was cruelty. Plain and simple. Nothing about you. Everything about him being a small man with a smaller heart." Nora stared at the road ahead. The tears she'd successfully fought off at the platform were closer now, loosened by the unexpectedness of his kindness. "He looked at me like I was livestock that didn't meet specifications," she said quietly. "Then he's a fool." Reid's voice was flat with certainty. "A woman's worth isn't in her face or her figure. It's in her character, her strength, what she does when life turns hard." He paused. "You stood on that platform with everyone watching, no money, no prospects. You didn't fall apart." "I nearly did." "Nearly doesn't count." She did cry then, quietly tilting her face slightly away, letting the tears slip without wiping them. They were different from the tears she'd fought at the platform. Those would have been tears of humiliation. These were something closer to release, the loosening of something she'd been clenching for so long, she'd forgotten she was clenching it. Lily began singing from the back of the wagon, something tuneless in sweet words that seemed to be invented as she went about birds and clouds and a horse named Clover. Her child's voice drifted away on the hot wind, and Nora let herself breathe. The ranch appeared as the sun touched the mountain peaks, a cluster of buildings that looked weathered but solid, built to withstand seasons and storms. The main house was larger than Nora had expected, 2 stories of dark wood with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. A barn stood off to one side, and beyond it a corral, several smaller outbuildings, in the neat rows of what must be the garden Reid had mentioned. As they drew closer, she could see the signs of a place where one man had been trying to do the work of 3 fences needing mending, shutters, hanging slightly askew, weeds encroaching on the garden beds. But there was care here too. The barn was well maintained, the animals in the corral looked healthy, and, despite the wear, everything had the air of a working ranch rather than a neglected one. Someone had built this place with intention. It showed. Reid pulled the wagon to a stop and helped Lily down first, then Nora. Lily immediately sprinted toward the barn, calling Clover's name. Reid watched her go with an expression Nora was already learning to read: love, mingled with a particular helplessness, the look of a man who understood animals and land and weather, but was perpetually uncertain about everything else. "Come on," he said, picking up her carpet bag before she could reach for it. "I'll show you around." The house was dim and cool inside after the punishing heat. A large main room served as both kitchen and living area, a stone fireplace along one wall, rough-hewn furniture that had been built for endurance rather than comfort, shelves of basic supplies, a cast-iron stove. Everything was clean but spare. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, none of the small feminine touches that turned a structure into a home. Reid showed her upstairs without ceremony. Lily's room, his room, and at the end of the narrow hall, a door that opened onto a small space barely large enough for the bed and dresser it contained. One window looked toward the mountains, the last light still painting them in shades of copper. "It's not much," he said. "It's more than I had an hour ago." She set her hand on the window frame, looking out at the mountains. "Thank you." When she turned, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully decipher, something complicated behind those gray eyes, something he wasn't ready to name. "You've had a hell of a day," he said. "Why don't you rest before supper?" But Nora shook her head. "I'd rather work if it's all the same to you. I think I need to do something useful." Understanding crossed his features. She saw it, the recognition of a sentiment he himself must have lived through, and he nodded. "All right then, show me what you can do with beans and salt pork." And she had the kitchen reorganized and the food underway. Within 20 minutes, her hands finding their way through the unfamiliar space with the ease of long practice. The cookware was good quality, just neglected a thorough cleaning. Tomorrow would sort it. The dried herbs near the window were another matter. Whoever had hung them up knew what they were doing. She recognized thyme sage, something that might have been wild marjoram. She used them. It felt good to have her hands occupied. She'd discovered this young in her aunt's kitchen in Philadelphia, that the body could carry the mind through crisis if the body was given something useful to do. Grief, humiliation, uncertainty, they all became smaller when measured against a cutting board and a hot stove. She found herself thinking about Warren Dench's letter. Not the most recent one, but the first, the one that had convinced her. He'd written about the ranch he managed. She'd thought he owned it. She understood now. She'd misread that, or he'd let her misread it, about the solitude of Montana winters and how he'd begun to feel the lack of companionship. There had been a passage about watching the sunrise on the mountains that had struck her as genuinely felt the kind of observation that couldn't be manufactured. She'd read it aloud to herself in her aunt's attic by the light of the one candle she was allowed. She wondered now how many women had received that same passage, how many candles had burned. Lily drifted in and out of the kitchen as Nora worked, perching on a chair to watch with the frank fascination of a child who'd been starved of female company. "Where are you from?" Lily asked. "Philadelphia. It's a city back east." "Is it big?" "Very big, loud, crowded." Nora sliced the salt pork with efficient strokes. "Nothing like this." "Do you miss it?" She considered the question honestly. "I miss what it was when my parents were alive. I don't miss what it became after." Lily absorbed this. "My mama died too," she said in the matter-of-fact tone children sometimes use for the largest truths. "I was 4.5. I don't remember her face exactly. Just pieces." A pause. The way she smelled like bread and soap, her singing. Nora's hand stilled on the cutting board. "Papa says I look like her," Lily continued, "but sometimes he gets sad and goes real quiet and his eyes look far away." She tilted her head. "He said something to me once after Mama died. I was scared she was gone forever, and he said, She stopped. What did he say? Lily's brow furrowed, working to get the words right. He said Mama would come back someday, in a different face. She looked up at Nora with those gray eyes wide and serious. I think about that sometimes. What he meant. The words fell into Nora's chest like a stone into still water. She stood very still for a moment, the knife forgotten in her hand, and looked at this 6-year-old girl who had been carrying this thought for 2 years. I think, Nora said carefully, that your father was trying to tell you something about love. That the people we love don't disappear, they show up in different ways. The kindness of a stranger, a garden that grows in the right soil. She paused. But your mother is your mother. No one replaces her. Lily looked at her for a long moment. Then she slid off the chair and went back to the barn without another word. Nora stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the sound of the stove, the distant nickering of horses, the particular silence of a place that had been waiting for something it couldn't name. The meal was finished as the last light left the sky. She'd made beans and salt pork biscuits from flour and lard, a sautéed mixture of wild onions from the pantry. Simple food, but food made with attention. She tasted as she went, adjusted, treated even a working meal as a thing worth doing properly. Reid took his first bite and went still. He looked at her across the table, something shifting in his expression. This is good, he said. It's just beans and salt pork. It's the first meal I've tasted in 2 years. He took another bite slower, this time as if making room for it. Mrs. Patton couldn't cook worth a damn, and I'm worse. We've been living on charred meat and burnt biscuits. Lily looked up from her plate with the expression of a witness called to confirm a known fact. Everything Papa makes tastes like smoke, she announced. Even the eggs. I do not. You do, Papa. She returned serenely to her beans. Even the coffee tastes like smoke. Something unexpected happened in Nora's chest, a small, warm movement like a flame finding oxygen. She smiled. It was the first real smile of the day, and it surprised her entirely. They ate in the comfortable silence of people who were tired and hungry and focused on food. When the plates were cleared, Reid sent Lily upstairs for bed and stayed at the table, his hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee, looking at the middle distance. You asked George what Dench said to him, Reid said finally. The platform. Yes. Did he tell you that Warren claimed I'd misrepresented something, that there were things in my past I hadn't disclosed? She met his eyes. There aren't. I was honest in every letter. There's nothing to disclose. Reid's jaw tightened. I know. You can't know that. You just met me. I know enough. He set down the mug. Dench has done this before, 2 women before you. First one got to town and found out he'd lied about owning his business. Turned out he just managed it for someone else. She left on the next train. Second one stayed 3 months and then left in the night. Nora absorbed this. And both times he let them leave no consequences. None that stuck. A long pause. He's a man who knows how to appear respectable, and respectability in a small town has more armor than you'd think. Upstairs, Lily's footsteps crossed the ceiling, then went still. From above came the creak of a bed, then silence. Why did you help me? Nora asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then my wife came west the same way, mail order arrangement. Her intended died of influenza 2 weeks before she arrived. She didn't know until she stepped off the train and found no one waiting. He turned the mug in his hands. Someone helped her, gave her a place to stay while she figured out what came next. If they hadn't... He stopped. She was the best thing that ever happened to me. When I saw you on that platform, I saw what could have gone differently. For her, the kitchen was very quiet. I'm sorry, Nora said softly, about your wife. So am I. He stood pushing back from the table. Get some rest. Morning comes early on a ranch. The rain came without warning. She'd been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when the sound woke her. Not thunder, just the soft, insistent drumming of an August storm, the smell of wet earth rising through her window in a wave so sudden and sweet it took her breath away. After 3 weeks of suffocating heat, she couldn't have stayed in bed if she'd tried. She pulled a shawl over her nightgown and went downstairs. Through the kitchen window, the yard was silver and dark rain coming down in soft, straight lines. She stood there for a moment, watching it, then heard a sound from the porch, the subtle creak of a chair. She pushed open the front door. Reid was sitting on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, watching the rain fall on the dark yard. He looked up when the door opened unsurprised, as if he'd heard her moving through the house. Couldn't sleep either, he said. It wasn't a question. She wrapped the shawl tighter and sat down on the step beside him, a careful distance between them close enough to speak at normal volume. The rain came down steadily, straight and gentle, not the violent summer storms she'd known in Philadelphia, but something quieter, older. For a while, neither of them said anything. The silence was strangely comfortable, the silence of two people who had been through something together, even if what they'd been through was only the strange compressed intimacy of an unexpected day. She planted the garden, Reid said eventually. Clara, she came out here with seeds from her mother's house back in Indiana, wrapped in cloth and packed at the bottom of her trunk. She could make anything grow. A pause. I've been trying to keep it going. I don't have her touch. Gardens take time, Nora said. They take learning the particular soil, the particular light. You can't rush it. I know that with cattle, with horses. Didn't think it applied to other things. It applies to most things. He looked at her sideways. Is that how you got through today, Patience? She thought about it honestly. I don't know what I am tonight, she said. I know what I was this morning, hopeful. I know what I was at noon, humiliated. Tonight I'm something else entirely. I haven't found the word for it yet. Surviving, he said. Maybe. That's enough. For tonight, that's plenty. The rain came down and the smell of wet sage rose from the yard, and somewhere in the barn a horse shifted in its stall with a sound like a long, slow exhale. Nora sat on the porch steps of a stranger's ranch and felt for the first time since the train platform that she was not in freefall. That the ground, however unfamiliar, was solid beneath her. She was like you in one way, Reid said after a long, quiet stretch. Clara, she didn't waste energy on the things she couldn't change. I'm still working on that. You're doing better than you think. He stood and the porch steps shifted under the redistribution of his weight. You should sleep. The garden will need your attention in the morning, the beans especially. He went inside. Nora stayed for a while longer, watching the rain slow to a mist, watching the mountains take shape against the lightning dark, watching the first tentative stars reappear as the clouds thinned. She thought about Lily's words. Papa said Mama would come back in a different face. She thought about what it must cost a man, a proud, private, self-sufficient man, to say something like that to a grieving 4-year-old in the dark. She thought about the way Reid had looked at her across the supper table when the beans turned out right. Not as though she were a utility, a function to be served. As though she were a person whose presence added something to the world. It was a small thing. It was not the future she had imagined. It was not what she had traveled 19 days and borrowed against the last of her mother's silver to find. But when she finally rose and went inside, climbing the narrow stairs in the dark house, and lay down in her small room with its mountain-facing window and the sound of rain fading to silence on the roof, Nora Hale did not feel like a woman who had lost everything. She felt faintly, impossibly like a woman who might be in exactly the right place. She just didn't know it yet, but she was beginning to. Morning on a working ranch came without ceremony. Nora woke to the sound of cattle and the creak of floorboards below her, the sky outside her window still more black than blue. She dressed quickly in her older work dress and went downstairs to find Reid already in the kitchen, crouched in front of the stove with the expression of a man engaged in a long-running argument with a piece of equipment that consistently won. Let me, she said. He stepped aside without comment. She had the fire going in 4 minutes, working with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd performed this task several thousand times in her life. By the time the kitchen began to warm, she had coffee measured and water heating and salt pork laid out on the board. Reid settled at the table with his coffee and watched her work. He didn't speak, but his watching had a quality she was already beginning to distinguish from ordinary observation, focus particular, the way a careful man reads terrain before crossing it. You're thinking about Dench, he said. She paused with the knife in her hand. Is it that obvious? You've been cutting that pork for about twice as long as necessary. She looked down. He was right. She'd reduced the slab to pieces considerably smaller than any recipe required. She set down the knife. He wrote in his letters about loneliness, she said, convincingly. I believed it was real. Maybe it was. Some men are genuinely lonely and still treat people badly. The two things aren't exclusive. He turned his mug in his hands. Or maybe he's just good at writing letters. Some men are better on paper than in person. I was careful. I read everything twice. I looked for inconsistencies. You were looking for the wrong things. He wasn't unkind about it. You were looking for dishonesty about facts. Whether he owned the land, whether his livestock numbers were accurate. You weren't looking for dishonesty about character because character's harder to fake in a letter. It takes longer. He probably hadn't shown you who he was yet. Nora stood still, taking this in. It was not comfort exactly, but it was something better. It was sense. How long did it take you, she asked, to know who Clara was? A pause. 6 months maybe. To know the shape of her. Longer to understand how she thought. Another pause different in quality. 3 years and I still found out things that surprised me. Lily appeared at the kitchen door in her nightgown, hair wild, blinking against the lamplight, with the bewildered expression of someone who'd woken in the middle of a dream and wasn't certain which side of sleep they'd landed on. You stayed, she said, looking at Nora. I did. The child nodded once decisively as if this resolved a significant internal question. Then she climbed into her father's lap without invitation and buried her face in his shoulder, and Reid's arm came around her automatically, and for a moment the three of them were still in the lamplight while the Montana dawn built outside the windows. Sharon. The garden was worse than Nora had thought and better than she'd feared. She surveyed it that morning while the dew was still on the grass, walking the rows with her hands clasped behind her back, and her eyes moving from plant to plant with the assessing focus her mother had taught her to use, not looking for what was wrong, but looking for what was still trying. The tomatoes were desperate for water, their leaves curling inward against the heat. The bean plants were being strangled by weeds that had found the rich soil and made themselves thoroughly at home. The squash vines had sprawled into the path and gone slightly wild for lack of guidance. But the bones of the garden were sound. Someone had laid it out with genuine knowledge, had positioned each bed to make the best use of light and drainage. Clara's work. Obviously. There was something moving about a garden that kept trying to live, even after the hands that planted it were gone. As if the seeds remembered what they were supposed to do and went on doing it despite everything. Mama planted this, Lily said from behind her shoulder, confirming what Nora had already concluded. Papa keeps trying, but he says plants don't like him. Plants don't like or dislike anyone. They just need the right attention. Nora knelt beside a tomato plant and pressed her fingers into the soil dry as old bread 2 inches down. Your father's been doing 3 people's work. Something had to give. It doesn't mean he doesn't care. Lila sat down cross-legged in the dirt beside her, apparently unconcerned about her dress. Can you fix it? I can try. It will take time. Nora sat back on her heels and looked at the child. And I'll need a helper who isn't afraid of dirty hands. Lily held up both palms, already dirty probably from the barn, with a trace of what might have been honey and was definitely not honey. I'm very good at dirty hands, she said seriously. They worked through the morning. Nora pulled weeds while Lily hauled water in a bucket, slightly too large for her, moving with the dogged determination of a child who decided to be useful. The sun climbed the heat belt, and the garden slowly shed its air of defeat and began to look, if not thriving, at least acknowledged. Reid appeared at mid-morning shirt already dark at the shoulders, hat pushed back. He stood at the edge of the garden and took in what had changed. The neat rows Nora had already cleared, the pile of weeds wilting in the sun, and something shifted in his expression. You don't have to do this, he said. The house is enough work. The garden was here before the house needed me, Nora said without looking up. It seemed ungrateful to leave it. He studied her for a moment with those gray eyes that gave very little away. Then he said, Water barrels are around back. Come find me in the barn if you need anything, and turned and walked back the way he'd come. Lily watched him go with the expression of a small and satisfied matchmaker. He never comes to check on the garden, she informed Nora. Not since last summer. He came to check on you, Nora said. You just happened to be in the garden. Lily considered this. Maybe both, she decided, and went back to her hauling. It was on the 4th day that Nora found the letter. She was reorganizing the upstairs storage space, what had been her room before Reid cleared it for her, and was now a jumbled space full of boxes, old tools, a broken chair, and things that hadn't found a home elsewhere. She was making room on the shelf for extra linens when a small wooden box slid off the top of a stack and fell, scattering its contents: buttons, a short length of ribbon, 2 coins, a folded piece of paper. She picked up the paper, meaning only to fold it back and return it to the box. But the paper unfolded in her hands as she gathered it, and she saw the handwriting. A woman's hand, careful, and even the ink faded to the brown of old leaves. She shouldn't have read it. She read the first 3 lines before she stopped herself. I am writing this because I cannot say it and because I need it to exist somewhere, even if only on paper. There is a man in Indiana who knew me before I came west, and sometimes in the winter evenings, I think about the life I might have had. I do not regret my choice. I chose Reid, and I would choose him again. But I think there is an honesty in admitting that some choices carry the weight of other roads not taken, and that a woman can love her life and still sometimes mourn the one she left behind. Nora folded the letter carefully and set it back in the box. She placed the box on the shelf with precise movements. She went downstairs and stood in the kitchen for a while, looking at nothing. She didn't know what it meant. She wasn't certain it meant anything or anything she had the right to interpret. People were complicated. Women who came west as mail-order brides were often leaving more than poverty or inconvenience behind. They were leaving whole lives, whole selves, whole futures that had been promised and then failed to materialize. The letter was the private reckoning of a private person with the particular calculus of an irreversible choice. What she knew with certainty was this: Clara had loved Reid. The letter said so explicitly. And more than that, it showed the mark of a woman who understood the difference between the truth of her feelings and the wisdom of speaking them. But there had been a man in Indiana. She was still thinking about it 2 hours later when Reid came in for the noon meal and found her at the stove stirring something with more force than it required. He stopped in the doorway. Something in her posture or her silence communicated itself to him because he said, "What's wrong?" "Nothing." She turned and met his eyes, and in the same instant understood that lying to this man would be both unnecessary and unsuccessful. He had the unnerving quality of someone who noticed things. "I found a box this morning in the storage room. A letter fell out. I read 3 lines before I realized what it was and stopped." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry, it wasn't my intention." Reid's face went very still. "Clara's box," he said. "Yes, I've put it back. I won't go near it again." He was quiet for long enough that she began to wonder if she'd misjudged badly, if this transgression, accidental as it was, would undo the fragile arrangement between them. Then he crossed the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water from the pump and stood with his back to her, drinking it slowly. "She was honest with me," he said at last to the window. "About most things. Maybe all things." A pause. "I knew there had been someone before. She never hid that entirely. She just didn't speak of it directly." "You don't have to tell me this." "I know." He set down the glass and turned. His expression was something she hadn't seen on him before, not grief huskily, but something that existed in the same country. Unguarded. "What 3 lines did you read?" she told him. He nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he'd already understood. "She chose this life," he said. "Every day she chose it. That's what I held on to afterward. Whatever else she felt, she stayed. She built something here. She planted that garden." He looked out toward the window, toward the visible corner of the green rose Nora had been tending. "She would have liked you. She liked people who didn't waste energy on things they couldn't change." "You said that before. About me. You keep proving it true." It was the plainest compliment she'd ever received, and somehow among the most meaningful. The trouble came from town before she was ready for it. She'd gone in with Reid on the Thursday supply run, her first time back in Harlan's Creek since the day of the train, and she noticed it immediately, the slight hesitation in the way George Fenn's wife Edna greeted her at the store counter. The 2 women who stepped slightly back when she entered. The man at the hardware side of the store who looked at her and then looked deliberately away. She didn't say anything to Reid. She completed the supply list, carried her share of the parcels to the wagon, and rode back to the ranch in silence, while Lily, sandwiched between them on the bench, chattered about the broader peppermint candy George had given her. It was Edna Fenn who told her when she came by the ranch 3 days later, with a dozen eggs and the expression of a woman delivering news she'd have preferred not to carry. "There's talk," Edna said, sitting at Nora's kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She was a practical woman, round-faced and steady, the kind of woman who cleaned up after disasters rather than causing them. "About your background, your time in Philadelphia." Nora set down her own cup very carefully. "What kind of talk?" Warren Dench has been saying things. Edna met her eyes, Pacific things. That there was a situation in Philadelphia, a man, a scandal, an arrangement that ended badly. That you came west to escape a reputation. The kitchen was very quiet. None of that is true, Nora said. I know that. Edna's voice was firm. Any woman who's spoken to you for 10 minutes knows it. But Harriet Calm has been carrying the story from parlor to parlor for 2 weeks, and you know how that works. Nora did know how that worked. She'd watched it happen to other women in Philadelphia, how a story once released into the right channels took on its own momentum, gathering detail and weight, until it was indistinguishable from fact. How there was no effective defense because defending yourself required repeating the accusation. Why would Warren Dench do this, she asked, though she could already see the shape of the answer. He rejected me. I'm no threat to him. I'm not even in his life. Edna's hands tightened slightly around the cup. A man like Warren Dench doesn't need a practical reason. He needs an explanation. He rejected you publicly in front of half the town, and then you turned up, installed at the Calloway Ranch, apparently thriving. That's a story that makes him look bad. A scandal, even a false one, changes the story. Makes his decision look like wisdom instead of cruelty. It was so simple once laid out. So precisely the kind of calculation that a man who'd been careful and clever and protected by a veneer of respectability for years would make without apparently thinking twice. He's done this before, Reid said from the doorway. Both women looked up. He'd come in from the barn without either of them hearing him. He moved quietly for a large man, and he stood in the kitchen door with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that Nora recognized as the contained version of something considerably less contained. What do you mean? Edna asked. The first woman he brought out, the one who discovered he didn't own the feed store. After she left, there were stories in the town about why she'd really gone. Stories that had nothing to do with what actually happened. His jaw was tight. I didn't connect it at the time. I should have. He looked at Nora with something in his eyes she hadn't seen directed at her before, not pity and not apology, but the particular quality of someone taking responsibility for something they hadn't caused, but should have prevented. I'll talk to him, Reid said. That won't help, Nora said quickly. If you confront him, it becomes a dispute between two men, and the stories about me get more interesting, not less. He'll say you're defending me because you've developed a personal interest, and that feeds the gossip instead of damping it. She'd thought through this already in the 40 seconds since Edna had told her. Leave it. Reid looked at her. You're sure? I'm sure that confronting Warren Dench won't fix this. I'm not sure what will. She picked up her coffee. But I'm not going to run, and I'm not going to stop going into town, and I'm going to keep doing my work, and eventually the story dies, because there's nothing in it to sustain it. That's the only defense that actually works. Edna Fenn was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Then the older woman said quietly, You're right, and I want you to know George and I believe you. There are others who do too. You have more allies in this town than you know. After Edna left, Reid stood in the kitchen for a moment without speaking. Then he said, I'm going to ride into town tomorrow, not to confront him, just to have a conversation with certain people about certain things. He held up a hand before she could object. It won't touch you. It'll be about him, about patterns, about a man who's done this before and should have faced consequences before now. Nora looked at him at the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his stillness and that she'd learned meant his mind was fully made up. All right, she said. All right, he agreed and went back to the barn. He came back from town late the following afternoon with a story she pieced together only gradually from the few words he offered and the expressions that crossed his face as he offered them. He had spoken to 3 men, the minister, the town alderman, and a rancher named Briggs, who'd been in Harlan's Creek longer than almost anyone and had a memory that went back accordingly. He hadn't raised his voice or made accusations or put his hand on anyone. He had simply asked questions in the careful way of a man who already knows most of the answers and is building a record. Warren Dench had managed the feed store for his uncle for 7 years. In those 7 years, he'd had 3 mail-order arrangements. The first woman had left quietly. The second had left less quietly, and then there had been rumors afterward, rumors that had never quite coalesced into anything actionable, but that certain people remembered. The third was Nora, and this time the rumors had already started before she'd been in town a month. Briggs knows, Reid said at supper. He's known for a while that something was wrong. He didn't have proof. Now he does, or he will, once he speaks to the women themselves. He's going to speak to them. The first one's still in Denver. The second one moved to a town 40 miles north. Both are reachable. He cut a piece of bread without looking at it. Briggs said he'll make sure it reaches the right ears. The town council, the uncle if necessary. Nora thought about this, about Warren Dench, who'd stood on a platform and destroyed her morning with a gesture that cost him nothing, and who'd followed it up by doing the same to her reputation without once risking his own. About the precision of it, the calculation. He thought I'd leave, she said. When the rumor started, he expected I'd go. Probably, Ben. Reid looked at her steadily. He was wrong. Whereas the fever came without warning on a Saturday in the worst heat of a week that had been building towards something catastrophic since Monday. Nora noticed at first not the fever itself, but the subtle wrongness in Lily's color at breakfast, a flush that wasn't quite right, a listlessness in her movements that was unlike the child's usual furious engagement with the world. She mentioned it to Reid before he left for the fence line. "Watch her," he said. "Call me if she gets worse." By mid-morning, Lily had stopped pretending the heat wasn't affecting her and retreated to the cool of the main room to lie on the floor with her slate too listless even for her usual conversation. By noon, she was asking for water every few minutes and complaining of a headache. By 2 o'clock, Nora had her hand on the child's forehead and felt unmistakably fever. She moved quickly and calmly, the calm of training, of having helped her mother nurse sick children in their Philadelphia neighborhood, and knowing that the appearance of steadiness in the person tending an ill child was itself a kind of medicine. She got Lily out of her dress and into a light nightgown. She brought up a basin of cool water from the well and cloths to soak in it. She got water into the child a sip at a time, cajoling when necessary and matter-of-fact about it. "This is how we get better. This is what we do." The fever climbed anyway. By the time Reid came in from the fields at 6, riding faster than usual because he'd seen something in the sky or the land or the particular quality of the afternoon that had told him something was wrong, Lily's temperature was alarming and her breathing had gone rapid and shallow. He took the stairs 2 at a time. Nora followed. In the bedroom, Lily lay small and still under the sheet, her face carrying the particular red of high fever, her eyes half open and unfocused. Reid knelt beside the bed and touched his daughter's cheek, and Nora saw his face go white beneath the rancher's tan. "How long?" His voice was barely audible. "Since early afternoon, I've been trying to bring it down." Nora came around to the other side. "It's not dropping. I need to ride for the doctor." He was already standing. "Morrison's office is 20 miles. 3 hours there, 3 back. That's 6 hours minimum and the fever's spiking." Nora met his eyes across the bed. "We fight it here, tonight. If she's not better by first light, you ride." He looked at his daughter, at the rapid rise and fall of her chest, at the alarming brightness of the fever in her face. Nora could see the war in him, the need to do something decisive, to move to act against the logic of what she was saying. "Tell me what to do," he said. "Cold well water every 15 minutes, change the moment the cloth warms. Keep getting fluid in her when she's conscious enough to swallow. We don't sleep." She was already wringing out the first cloth. "We just keep working until the fever breaks." He moved to the other side of the basin and began helping without another word. They worked through the evening and into the night in near silence, their rhythm developing without discussion, the way two people who are very tired and very frightened can sometimes achieve an efficiency that would be impossible in calmer circumstances, because the calmness has been stripped away and only the essential remains. Change the cloth, coax in water, count breaths, change the cloth again. The house creaked and settled around them in the darkness. Through the open window, Nora could hear the ranch continuing its ordinary nighttime business, cattle lowing somewhere on the far side of the pasture, a horse shifting in the barn, the periodic call of an owl from the cottonwoods near the creek. The world outside was completely indifferent to what was happening in this bedroom, and that indifference was obscurely comforting. Nothing had stopped. The world was still turning. This was not the end of things. She said this to Reid once around 10 o'clock when Lily had drifted into a restless doze and Reid had gone to the window to stare at the dark yard with the set jaw of a man who needed to be doing something physical and had nothing to do. "The world's still turning," she said. He looked at her over his shoulder. "That's supposed to help." It helped me on the platform today last week. She corrected herself. The day on the platform felt like something from another life, though it had been less than 2 weeks ago. When everything I'd planned had just come apart, the train didn't wait. The town kept going. People went home to their suppers. She paused. Life doesn't stop for personal disaster. Sometimes that's a comfort. Reid turned back to the window. Clara used to say something like that the cattle still needed feeding even when she was heartbroken, that there was something steadying about being needed in a plain way. She sounds like someone worth knowing. She was. His voice was rough with the memory and with tiredness. She would have figured this out by now. She had a way with sick things, animals, children, plants. Patient and steady, and he stopped. I don't have that. I don't know how to be that. You've been sitting beside her for 4 hours, Nora said. What do you call that? He didn't answer. But he came back to the bedside and picked up the cloth and began to help again. And whatever had been in his face when he was at the window, the helplessness, the old grief layered under the new fear was replaced by something more workable purpose. Around midnight, Lily's fever spiked higher. She began to shake, chills racking her small body in violent waves that made no sense given the heat of the room. Reid wrapped her in a light blanket and held her, his large frame bent over her small one, in a posture of fierce protective helplessness. This is how it started with Clara, he said. His voice had gone strange, as if the words were coming from somewhere very far down. The fever came fast. She said it was nothing. 48 hours later. He stopped. Nora reached across the bed and took his hand. This is not that, she said. Lily is 6 years old and strong. This is a summer fever, not what took Clara. You can't know. No, but I can believe it. And right now, that's what she needs from both of us. She squeezed his hand once hard. She needs to hear your voice. Tell her something. He looked at his daughter, her eyes closed and her breathing labored, her hair dark with sweat. Then he leaned down and spoke quietly close to her ear. Listen to me, little bird. I know it hurts right now. I know you're scared. But you're the toughest person on this ranch, and that includes me, and I need you to keep fighting. His voice wavered once, then steadied. Your mama was tough, and you are too. You hear me? You keep fighting. Lily's eyes didn't open, but something shifted in her breathing, infinitesimally, barely perceptible. Or perhaps they imagined it. Either way, Reid straightened and reached for the basin, and they went on working. Around 2 in the morning, Nora sent Reid downstairs to rest. He refused at first, and she said the same thing she'd said to patients in Philadelphia, that he needed an hour, that she would not leave, that an exhausted man was no use to anyone, and eventually the logic of it wore him down and he went. In the silence after his footsteps faded, she sat beside Lily and talked. She'd discovered early in the long night that talking helped her stay awake, and she'd told herself it might comfort the child even in sleep, the sound of a voice steady and continuous, the sound of someone choosing to stay. She talked about her mother's garden in Philadelphia, about the year her mother had grown strawberries in the small square of backyard earth and brought home the first handful in her apron pocket, already warm from the sun, and they'd eaten them standing at the kitchen window. She talked about the smell of her father's pipe tobacco and the way he'd read aloud to her on Sunday evenings, patient with the difficult words. She talked about what it had felt like to lose them both in the same terrible week, one after the other, as if the illness had decided it wasn't satisfied with half a family. She talked about the train journey west, the way the landscape had changed outside the window the moment she'd first seen mountains and understood why people traveled so far to reach them. And then, because it was 3 in the morning and she was very tired and the darkness had removed whatever filters she'd been maintaining, she talked about the ranch itself, about the way the morning light came through her bedroom window and lit the mountain peaks in shades of copper and rose, about the vegetable garden and the satisfaction of watching things grow under her hands, about the smell of the kitchen when something good was on the stove. You have to stay with us, she said quietly, changing the cloth on Lily's forehead. Your father needs you. I need you. You've become so important to me in just a few weeks. I didn't expect that. I didn't come here expecting to find someone I'd grieve. She wrung out the cloth again. But here we are, and I'm not ready to lose you. So you need to fight. Reid returned exactly 1 hour later, as he'd promised, looking no less exhausted, but with his jaw set in fresh determination. He looked at Lily, then at Nora, and she shook her head no. Change still fighting, he nodded and took up his position, and they went on. Dawn came the way it always did on the Montana prairie, not with a single dramatic gesture, but with a slow and incremental concession of the dark, the eastern sky going gray, then pewter, then the faintest rose, each stage happening so gradually it was impossible to name the moment night became morning. At 5:43, Nora put her hand to Lily's forehead and felt it. The fever had broken. The skin beneath her palm was warm, still warmer than it should be the aftermath of the long night, but the burning quality, the alarming dry heat that had been there since yesterday afternoon was gone. Lily's breathing had slowed. The desperate, rapid flutter of her chest had given way to something deeper, more natural. "Reid," Nora said. He was across the room in an instant, his hand going to his daughter's forehead before Nora had finished saying his name. She felt him go still, completely, entirely still, in the way of someone who has been braced for impact and has just discovered that the thing they feared is not after all coming. Then Lily's eyes opened. They were confused at first, unfocused, traveling between the two faces above her with the slow effort of someone finding their way back from a long distance. Then they settled on her father. "Papa," she said. Her voice was rough, barely a whisper. "Why are you in my room?" Reid closed his eyes. He sat down on the edge of the bed and gathered his daughter into his arms, with the care of someone handling the most precious thing they've ever held. And Nora looked at the two of them, big weather-hardened man and the small feverish girl, and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. Something that felt in the early morning light very much like home. "You were sick," Reid said into Lily's hair. "Very sick, but you fought through it just like I knew you would." "I don't feel very fought," Lily said. Then more quietly, "Was Elena here, Nora?" Nora said gently from the other side of the bed. "And yes, I was here all night." Lily looked at her, in the gray morning light with the fever's aftermath still in her face and her hair tangled from the long night. She had an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and a clarity that sometimes came to people who'd been very close to the edge of something. "I heard you," she said, "talking to me when I was asleep." "You did? You said I'd become important to you." The child's voice was faint with tiredness. "I remember." Nora couldn't answer for a moment. She'd said those words in the deep of the night when she'd thought no one could hear, when she'd been talking to keep herself awake, and had said things she hadn't intended to say, things she hadn't even known were true until they came out of her mouth in the dark. "I meant it," she said. Lily nodded, apparently satisfied that this question had been settled. "I heard Papa too," she said. "He said I was tough." "You are. He doesn't say things like that very often." She paused. "He says things with what he does instead of with words. Mama used to say that about him." A longer pause. "I think you understand that about him already." Nora looked at this 6-year-old girl who had apparently spent the last 2 years paying close attention to things adults said about each other and storing the results for future reference, and thought, yes, she does understand him. Probably better than he understands himself. "Rest now," she said. "We can talk when you are better." Lily closed her eyes, apparently satisfied. Within minutes, she was asleep again. Real sleep this time, the deep, natural sleep of the recovering. Her face relaxed and her breathing even and slow. Nora looked up. Reid was watching her from across the bed. She became aware suddenly of the quality of the silence between them. Not uncomfortable, not charged exactly, but weighted, containing something that the long night had built without either of them deciding to build it. They had been in this room together for 9 hours. They had been frightened together and worked together and held each other's hands in the dark. There was a kind of knowledge that came from that, a knowledge of a person that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with pressure, the way a stone could tell you everything about the river that had shaped it. "You should sleep," she said. "You've been up all night." "So have you." "I'll sleep after." He didn't move. He was still watching her with those gray eyes that didn't give much away, but gave her something, the sense of being truly seen, which was a different thing from being observed. "Nora," he said. "Reid." Whatever he was going to say next, he didn't say it. Not then. He simply stood nodded once, the private, decisive nod of a man who has reached a conclusion, and went downstairs to start the morning. But something had changed in the space of that long night, in the dark hours between fear and relief in the cold water, and the held hands and the words spoken in the dark that had apparently been heard. Nora Hale, standing in the morning light beside a sleeping child who had said, "You became important to me," thought about a letter she'd read 3 lines of about choices and roads not taken, about a garden that kept trying long after the hands that planted it were gone. Then she went to start breakfast. Whatever came next, the day needed feeding. He proposed on a Thursday morning, 5 days after Lily's fever broke, while they were both standing in the garden. Nora had been there since early light, working the soil between the bean rows, which had recovered faster than she'd expected. The plants were putting out new growth, now small and determined, the green of things that had decided to survive. Reid had come out an hour after sunrise, ostensibly to check the water level in the barrels. He'd stood at the edge of the garden and watched her work without speaking for long enough that she'd begun to suspect the barrels had nothing to do with why he was there. When he spoke, he looked at the mountains, not at her. "I've been thinking about what happens when you figure out your next move," he said. Nora sat back on her heels. "Have you?" "I've been trying to think about it practically. What the arrangement was, what it was supposed to lead to." A pause. "I keep arriving at the same problem." She waited. "The arrangement was supposed to be temporary," he said, "but the ranch doesn't feel temporary anymore. Lily doesn't feel temporary." He turned then and looked at her directly with the unguarded quality she'd seen in him only a few times before, in the night of the fever, and in the kitchen after the letter, and once on the porch in the rain. "And you don't feel temporary to me." The morning was very still. The mountains sat on the horizon, blue and enormous, indifferent as always to the small human events at their feet. "What are you saying?" she asked, though she knew. "I'm saying I'd like you to stay." He looked down at his hat, which he was turning in his hands. She'd noticed he did this when he was working through difficult terrain. Not as help, not as an arrangement. He met her eyes. "As my wife, as Lily's mother, as someone who's as much a part of this place as I am." A pause. "If that's something you could want." Nora looked at him, at the weathered face and the gray eyes and the hands that had held his daughter through the worst night and held hers across a sick child's bed. She thought about everything she'd lost and gained in the space of the strangest month of her life. She thought about what it felt like to sit in that kitchen in the morning and know she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "It is," she said. "Yes." Reid nodded as if they'd confirmed a fence line. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the preparation for one. "Saturday week," he said. "The minister can come out. I'll write in tomorrow. You're not worried about what people will say? It's been less than a month. Let them say it." He settled his hat back on his head. "They're already talking. Better to give them something definitive to talk about." He paused. "Unless you need more time." "I don't need more time," she said. And she meant it, not because she wasn't still learning him, because she would be learning him for years, but because she understood already the essential quality of the man, the thing he was made of, and that was enough to choose by. He went back to the barn without another word, but she saw from across the yard the particular way he was holding himself, slightly different, slightly lighter, and understood it was the same feeling she was carrying. It was Edna Fenn who brought the rest of the story. She came by 4 days later with a crock of preserves and the expression of someone carrying news that was too large for a single person to hold alone. "Sit down," she said to Nora. "I have something to tell you." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the way they had before, with the familiar geography of difficult news between them. "I spoke to Briggs," Edna said, "and Briggs spoke to both of the women, the ones who came before you." Nora waited. "The first woman, her name is Constance. She lives in Denver now. She works as a seamstress. She told Briggs that after she left Harlan's Creek, Warren Dench wrote her. Not to apologize, to threaten her. He told her that if she spoke to anyone about what had happened, he'd spread stories about her in Denver the same way he'd spread them here." Edna's hands were flat on the table. She believed him. She's been quiet for 3 years. "And the second one, Margaret, she's in a town called Foster Falls, 40 miles north. She stayed at the ranch for 3 months, which Briggs found interesting because Warren says she left. She says he drove her out, made her life impossible, told her she was unwanted. isolated her from anyone in town who might have helped. Edna paused. She never spoke up because she thought no one would believe her. Because he was established, and she was a stranger, and she had no proof. Nora sat with this information, feeling its shape, its weight. But now there are three of us, she said. Three women who can say the same thing independently. That changes the arithmetic. Edna met her eyes. Briggs is taking it to the town council. He believes Warren's uncle will remove him from managing the feed store once he understands what's been happening. And there may be legal consequences. What he did to Margaret in particular, the way he deliberately isolated and harassed her, may be actionable. Nora thought about Constance in Denver with her seamstress needles and her silence. About Margaret 40 miles north living in a town she hadn't chosen among people who didn't know her. About all the ways a man like Warren Dench could stand in plain sight and do damage without anyone quite seeing him clearly enough to stop it. "What do they need from me?" she asked. "A letter, if you are willing, to the council describing your experience. What he said to George Fenn, what you observed, what followed." Edna paused. "It would be stronger coming from three women than from two. And you're the one who stayed, the one who didn't run." Nora thought about Reid, about telling him this, about what he would say. She already knew what he would say. "I'll write the letter," she said. Reid read the draft she showed him that evening without comment. Then he set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know. It will put your name in the council record. People will talk." "People are already talking." She folded the letter. "And two women in Denver and Foster Falls spent 3 years being quiet, and Dench spent those 3 years doing exactly what he wanted with no consequences at all." She looked at Reid steadily. "I stayed. That means something. I want it to mean something useful." Reid was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and went to the desk in the corner of the main room, a desk she'd never seen him use that held a few ledgers and a jar of pens, and came back to the table with a fresh sheet of paper. "Tell me what you want to say," he said. "I'll write it with you." They spent 2 hours on the letter, Nora drafting and Reid reading, both of them, revising, finding the right words. Words that were precise and factual and impossible to dismiss as emotional or overwrought. When they were done, it was a clear-eyed account of exactly what had happened, with dates and specific statements and nothing that could be construed as exaggeration. Reid signed it as well at the bottom, as a witness to what he'd observed. "You don't have to do that," Nora said. "I know." He set down the pen. "But I was there. I saw what George's face looked like after Dench spoke to him. I saw what happened to you on that platform." He blew gently on the ink to dry it. "And I'm going to be your husband in 6 days. His reputation for this should have a consequence." Nora looked at the 2 signatures at the bottom of the letter, her careful hand, his larger one, beside it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me for telling the truth," he said. "It's the minimum." 3 days before the wedding, Harriet Cullum arrived at the ranch. Nora was on the porch when the buggy came up the road, and she recognized both the vehicle and the woman holding the reins before they were close enough to speak. Her first instinct was to go inside to let Reid handle it, to avoid whatever had brought Harriet Cullum to the Calloway ranch on a Tuesday afternoon. Her second instinct, the one she'd been training herself toward since the day on the platform, was to stand where she was. She stood where she was. Harriet tied up the horse with the focused movements of a woman performing a task she might not have decided to complete until this very moment. She walked to the porch steps and stopped at the bottom, looking up at Nora with an expression that Nora had never seen on her face before. Not satisfaction, not disapproval, not the particular bright cruelty that had been there on the platform. Something considerably harder than any of those, the look of a person preparing to say something they don't know how to say. The last time Nora had seen Harriet Cullum, the woman had been in the general store on a Tuesday, standing near the dry goods counter with 2 friends and turning slightly away when Nora walked in. An act of deliberate social exclusion, small in itself, but accumulated with enough similar gestures to form a wall. Nora had bought her flour and her thread and walked out with her chin level, and afterward had stood beside the wagon for a moment, breathing Montana air and reminding herself of what she'd told Reid: the story dies when there's nothing in it to sustain it. Be patient. Keep going. Patience had felt that Tuesday like a very thin garment in cold weather. She had not expected to see Harriet Cullum standing at her porch steps 3 days before her wedding. Mrs. Calloway, Harriet said. Then correcting herself, Miss Hale, I suppose you are not yet. I'm Nora, Nora said. Come up if you like. Harriet climbed the steps with a deliberateness that suggested her knees bothered her, though she would have denied it if asked. She didn't sit in the chair Nora gestured to, but stood at the railing and looked out at the yard for a moment before turning. I've heard about the letter, she said, what you've written to the council, what the other women have said. And you know the truth of it? I suspected. Harriet's voice had lost its performing quality. What was left was smaller and more real. Not the specifics, but I've known Warren Dench for years and I've observed things. I chose not to see them clearly. A pause that cost her something. I chose to believe the story he told because it was simpler. And because, she stopped. Because it gave you someone to be better than, Nora said. Not unkindly, as a fact. Harriet's expression did not change, but something shifted beneath it. Yes, she said. That's honest, more honest than I deserve. She looked at the yard at the garden with its recovered rows at the barn where they could hear Reid working. I want to tell you something that you have no particular reason to believe. Tell me. 31 years ago, I came to Harlan's Creek as a mail-order bride. The words fell into the afternoon quiet like stones. My intended's name was Walter Calm. He was a decent man and he became a good husband, and I've had a good life. She paused. But the year before I came west, there was another arrangement, a man in Missouri, a man I'd been corresponding with for 6 months. I arrived to find that he'd married someone else 3 weeks prior and simply hadn't written to tell me. A longer pause. I stood at the station in Kansas City for 4 hours before someone from the church helped me arrange passage to the next town. No one from the station came to ask if I was all right. The men looked away. The women looked at me like I was a warning. Nora stood very still listening. When I eventually arrived in Harlan's Creek and found Walter and found my footing, I told myself I would be different, that I would be the woman who stepped forward. Harriet's hands gripped the railing. Instead, when you arrived and Warren did what he did, I stepped back and made it worse. Because somewhere in 31 years of finding my place in this town, I forgot what it felt like to be the woman on the platform. A pause. Or I didn't forget. I just stopped letting myself remember. The yard was very quiet. A bird called from the cottonwood trees by the creek. Far in the distance, one of the horses nickered. I've been asking myself why, Harriet said. Why someone who knew what that felt like could do to another woman what was done to me. She looked at Nora with something that was tired and clear and had put down most of its pretense. The answer is that I'd built a life here. And people who've worked very hard to establish themselves sometimes protect that establishment by standing with the established, even when the established is wrong. It's cowardly, I know that. Yes, Nora said, it is. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm telling you what happened because you deserve to know the truth of what was behind it, and because I've been carrying it since that day on the platform. She straightened. And because carrying it has become considerably heavier since I read your letter to the council. What changed when you read the letter? Harriet was quiet for a moment. You named what he did, clearly and specifically and without embellishment. And when I read it, I understood properly, understood not just abstractly that I had helped him do it, that my behavior on the platform and my spreading of his stories gave him cover, made the thing easier. She set her jaw. I'm going to speak to the council as a character witness and as someone who will correct the record publicly about what I said and did. Nora looked at this woman, at the carefully held posture, the controlled expression, the effort it had cost her to climb these porch steps and say these words. I accept what you've said, Nora told Hiram, not because it undoes anything, but because honesty is worth acknowledging. And because I think it cost you something to say it. Harriet stood with her back half-turned, her hat slightly askew from the wind. Saturday, she said finally, I'll be at the wedding. Then she went down the steps and climbed into her buggy and drove back toward town, and Nora stood on the porch watching her go, feeling the particular texture of a complicated thing beginning to resolve. Not a happy ending, exactly the wrong that had been done was real. And real things don't undone themselves, but a reckoning. A settling of accounts. The beginning of something that might eventually become repair. She thought about Constance in Denver, Constance with her seamstress needles and her 3 years of enforced silence. She thought about Margaret in Foster Falls, making a life in a town she hadn't chosen. She hoped that word would reach them. She would write to both of them, she decided. Not because she could fix what had happened, but because no one should have to carry something alone when there was someone else who understood the weight of it. Reid appeared from around the side of the barn, drawn by the sound of the departing buggy. He stopped when he saw her expression. "Harriet Cullum," he said. "Yes." And Nora looked at the road where the buggy had gone at the dust still settling in its wake. "And she'll be at the wedding." Reid looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Kwatamomo," in the quiet way he said things that meant considerably more than the single word. "Yes," Nora agreed, and "good." The morning of the wedding was clear in very hot Montana in late August. The sky that specific fierce blue that looked hand-painted, the mountains crisp on the horizon as if someone had cut them from better paper. Nora woke earlier than usual and lay for a moment in the pre-dawn dark, taking inventory of what she felt. She felt, to her own surprise, completely calm. Not the false calm of someone suppressing anxiety, but the genuine steadiness of a person who has made a decision they believe in and is simply waiting for the moment to arrive. She'd made reckless decisions in her life. Coming west to marry a stranger might qualify as one, but this was not reckless. This was the most clearly seen choice she'd ever made. She knew this man. She knew his silences and the particular quality of his attention and the way he looked at his daughter and the way he'd looked at her across a sick child's bed in the small hours of the worst night. She knew what he was made of. That was enough. More than enough. She dressed in the cream dress she'd made from Clara's fabric. She'd finished it 3 nights ago by lamplight, sitting at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed. The stitches even, and careful the bodice, fitted simply, the skirt full enough for movement. It was a practical dress that happened to be beautiful. She thought Clara would have approved of the distinction. She stood at the window for a moment before going downstairs, looking at the mountains in the first light. They were the same mountains she'd seen from the train platform, the same indifferent peaks, but everything else around them had changed. She was not the same woman who'd stood among torn photographs and public humiliation. She was not the woman who'd ridden in a wagon behind a stranger trying to figure out if she'd made a catastrophic mistake. She was something she hadn't known to want, a woman who had built her place stone by stone in a landscape that hadn't asked for her and had slowly made room. When she came downstairs, Reid was in the kitchen in his Sunday clothes. Dark trousers, a white shirt. He'd clearly ironed himself with more determination than experience, his hair still damp from the well. He turned when she came in, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because sometimes there isn't anything useful to say, and the moment is better served by simply being in it. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said. "You'll make me nervous." "All right." The corner of his mouth moved. "Coffee's ready." Lily appeared at the kitchen door in the blue dress Nora had made her for the occasion, with the blue ribbon in her braider that her father had remembered to bring from town. She looked at Nora with the expression of someone who had planned this outcome from the beginning and was enjoying its completion with the particular satisfaction of a matchmaker who was also 6 years old and had never doubted the result. "Are you ready?" Lily asked. "I am," Nora said. "Are you?" "I've been ready since forever," Lily said, and went outside to wait. The ceremony was held on the front porch in the shade, with the mountains behind them and the meadow grass moving in a slight, hot breeze. The guests were few: George and Edna Fenn, who'd arrived early with a cake Edna had made. "Every wedding needs something sweet," she said, pressing it into Nora's hands, and a ranching couple named the Jensens from the neighboring property, and the minister who had ridden 20 miles without complaint, and Harriet Cullum, who stood at the edge of the gathering in a blue-gray dress and did not say a word to anyone, but stood straight and present, bearing witness in the way she should have borne witness 5 weeks ago. The minister was a thin man with kind eyes and the easy manner of someone who'd officiated at enough weddings to know which kind was which ceremonies were full of hope, and which of obligation, and which, like this one, of something harder won and more durable than either. He looked at Reid and Nora standing before him and seemed to find what he was looking for. He spoke about partnership, about the courage required to build something from unfamiliar ground. He spoke about the kind of love that arrived not all at once, but in increments, in a meal, shared a long night, endured a garden tended back to life. He did not speak of romance, and neither Reid nor Nora needed him to. Nora's vows were the ones she'd written at the kitchen table. "I, Nora Hale, take you, Reid Calloway, as my husband and my partner. I promise to work beside you, to be honest with you, to stand by you when things get hard, and to build something with you that neither of us could build alone. I promise to be a true wife and a true mother. I promise to stay. That last line, I promise to stay, was not in any ceremony she'd ever attended. She'd added it for Lily. Reid's vows were not the formal language of the ceremony the minister had offered him. He'd said quietly before they'd begun that he wanted to say his own, and the minister had agreed, and now he stood holding Nora's hands and speaking in the plain, direct way he did everything. I, Reid Calloway, take you, Nora Hale, as my wife. I can't promise you easy. I can't promise you comfortable or simple or without hardship. But I can promise you this: I will show up every day. I will work beside you. I will be honest with you, even when it's inconvenient, and I will stand by you in front of whoever needs to be faced. A pause. And I will see you, not the version of you that's easiest or most convenient, the actual you that I promise. Nora's eyes stung. She blinked. She had not expected that last part. When the minister pronounced them married, Reid cupped her face in his rough hands and kissed her with the same careful quality he brought to everything he did, thorough and unhurried, as if this too was something worth doing properly. Lily cheered so enthusiastically that she startled a crow from the cottonwood tree near the creek. Edna cried. George clapped Reid on the shoulder with genuine warmth. The Jensens offered congratulations with the uncomplicated friendliness of people who'd been neighbors for years and approved of the development. Even Harriet Colnham made a sound that might in certain lights have been interpreted as approval. They ate the cake on the porch in the shade, drinking lemonade that Nora had made that morning while the dew was still on the grass. It was modest and it was exactly right. Later, when the guests had gone and the long afternoon was settling toward evening, Lily found Nora in the garden, a habit by now, both of them. The garden is the place where important conversations happen between the bean rows. Nora, Lily said. She was still in her blue dress, grass-stained at the hem already. Can I ask you something? Of course. Can I call you Mama now? She said it carefully in the manner of someone who has been thinking about how to say something for a long time and is finally ready to say it. I know you're not my real mama. Papa explained that. He said my real mama is always my mama, no matter what. But he also said that families can grow. She paused. And you feel like a mama to me. You felt like a mama for a while. I just didn't know if I was allowed to say it. Nora set down the trowel she'd been holding. She looked at this 7-year-old girl, at the gray eyes, and the dark braids, and the grass-stained dress, and the expression that was trying very hard to be composed, and was not entirely succeeding, and felt something open in her chest that had been sealed a long time. You're allowed, she said. Her voice was steady. She made it steady. I would be so honored if you called me Mama. Lily launched herself forward without further ceremony, the way she did everything, and Nora caught her and held on, and the child's arms around her neck were fierce and certain and entirely at home. Okay, Lily said into her shoulder. Mama. Nora closed her eyes. She held on. You should see your father's face, Edna Fenn said from somewhere behind them, and Nora looked up to find that Reid had come from the barn and was standing at the garden's edge, and the look on his face was the most complete thing she'd ever seen on it, relief and joy, and something that had been waiting a very long time to put itself down. She can see my face just fine from here. Reid said, his voice rough, and came and put his arms around both of them. You chose well, Edna said quietly to no one in particular, and went back and bowed to help with the dishes. The news about Warren Dench reached them a week later through George, who brought it with the carefully neutral expression of a man delivering information and making no comment on his own feelings about it. The council had reviewed the letters, Nora's, Constance's, Margaret's, and Harriet Colnham's formal account. They had spoken to Warren, who had denied everything with a fluency that surprised none of them and convinced none of them. The uncle, when presented with the record, had been brief. Warren was removed from managing the feed store effective immediately. There would be no criminal proceedings. The nature of what he'd done was wrong without being clearly illegal. And the women who might have brought charges had decided understandably that they'd rather build forward than dwell in the past. But his name and his character were now a matter of public record, and Harlan's Creek was a town that had a long memory. He's leaving, George said. Heading to Helena, I'm told. Fresh start. Reid said nothing. He'll do it again somewhere else, Nora said quietly. Probably. Reid looked at her. But not here, and the women in Helena will know who he is. Word travels. He paused. You did what you could do. That matters. She knew he was right, and she let it settle in her what she'd done not as triumph, which it wasn't, but as a kind of completion. She'd arrived in this town as a stranger who had been discarded. She was leaving that version of herself behind, not because the experience hadn't happened, but because she'd chosen not to let it be the defining thing. She was Nora Calloway now. She'd built that name with her own hands. On a morning in late September, 3 weeks after the wedding, Nora stood in the garden in the early light and looked at what it had become. The bean rows were producing more than they could eat. The tomatoes were heavy and red, requiring daily picking. The squash had been brought under control and was putting out its last flush of the season, the vines golden at the edges now turning with the turning year. She'd canned 40 jars of preserves since August, tomatoes, beans, pickles, apple butter, from fruit. Catherine Jensen had brought from her small orchard, and they stood on the cellar shelves in neat rows, each one a form of promise against winter. She heard footsteps behind her, not the quick, light ones of Lily, but the long, deliberate stride of Reid coming from the barn. He stopped at the edge of the garden and looked at it the way he'd looked at it the first day she'd worked it, with that particular attention that didn't miss anything. She would have liked this, he said. Nora didn't look up from the tomato she was checking. Yes. A pause. She would have liked you. Nora sat back on her heels and looked at her husband, and he was standing in the early light with his hat pushed back and his hands in his pockets, and he had the look he sometimes had in the mornings before the work got fully underway, open, unguarded, still carrying something of the night's honesty before the day's practicality set in. What are you thinking about? She asked. The same thing I think about most mornings. He came and crouched beside her among the bean rows, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. How different everything is from what I expected my life to look like. He looked at the mountains on the horizon. 2 years ago, I was managing. Just managing. Getting through each day because Lily needed me to. But not, he stopped. Not choosing it, she said. Not choosing it. Yes. He looked at her. No, I choose it. Every morning I wake up and I choose it. That's your doing. Nora felt the words land in her chest in the way that plain, true things did when they were said at the right moment. You'd have been all right without me, she said. Maybe, but all right isn't the same thing. He stood and offered her his hand, and she took it, and he pulled her to her feet. Come and see what I want to show you. He led her to the rise behind the barn, a small hill that looked out over the whole property, the house and outbuildings and garden laid out below them, the pastures rolling toward the mountains in the distance. She'd been up here before, but not often, not with him. I've been thinking about building on, he said, adding a room for lessons, so Lily has a proper space for her books and her slate, and a bigger kitchen the way you mentioned, with a longer table. He was quiet for a moment. This is your home. I want you to have a say in what it becomes. Nora looked out over the property. Over the garden she'd rescued from neglect, the porch where she'd sat in the rain with a man she didn't yet know, the window of the small room that had been her first space in this place before it became something else. Over the barn where Lily ran to say good morning to Clover before anything else, and the fence line that Reid was always mending, and the kitchen where the smell of something good had begun to be a constant rather than a special occasion. She thought about a woman named Constance in Denver who'd received a letter from Nora last week and had written back in a hand that trembled slightly at the edges, but spoke in full sentences about what she was building now, what she'd planted in the small garden behind the seamstress shop, how the morning light came through the east-facing window at a particular angle that she'd started to love. She thought about Margaret in Foster Falls, who'd written a shorter letter, more careful, but had written. Both women had said the same thing in their different ways. Thank you for not letting it disappear. Thank you for making it count. She thought about Harriet Colm, who'd spoken to the council and spoken in public, and been seen doing it by everyone who'd watched her hold a fan and perform judgment on a train platform. Who was not, Nora suspected, quite the same woman she'd been before that Tuesday afternoon on the porch steps. Who would never be entirely an ally, some people remained too complicated for that, but who had moved from one thing to another, and that movement mattered. She thought about Warren Dench and Helena starting over, and she let the thought go. Not because it didn't matter, but because it was outside the boundary of what she could change, and she'd learned, was still learning how to distinguish between those things. A schoolroom, she said, and yes to the kitchen. She paused. And maybe someday, when we're ready, a room for someone smaller than Lily. Reid was very still beside her. Then he turned, and the look on his face was the most unguarded she'd ever seen, more than the night of the fever, more than the morning on the porch steps. He was entirely present in it, without armor or caution, and it was the truest thing he'd said without saying a word. Yes, he said, when we're ready. They stood together on the rise and looked at their life spread out below them, imperfect, hard-won, built from broken pieces, and unexpected gifts, and the stubborn daily choice to stay. The mountains kept their ancient indifference in the distance. The garden kept its growing. The fence line needed mending in the northwest corner, and there was a section of roof on the smaller outbuilding that would want attention before winter. And the list of things to be done was as long as it had ever been, and would never be entirely shorter. None of that was the point. The point was who would be doing it, though. Nora Calloway, who had arrived in this valley as a woman left behind, stood in the September sun and understood what she'd found here. Not the future she'd planned, not the romantic story she'd told herself on 3 weeks of train journeys, but something truer and more durable than either. A life built by hand. A family assembled not by birth or arrangement, but by the accumulated weight of showing up day after day for each other. She had been left on a platform. She had been found. And in the space between those two things, in the garden rose, and the long nights, and the porch in the rain, and the small hand reaching for hers, and the moment a child said "Mama" for the first time and meant it, she had somehow found herself. From the barn below came the sound of Lily's voice. "Papa, Nora, come see what Clover did." Bright and certain, and entirely at home, the sound of a child who had learned again that the people she loved stayed. Reid called back, "Coming, little bird." He looked at Nora. She looked at him. There was nothing in his expression that needed translation anymore. She could read every register of it, the humor and the steadiness, and the thing that had been building since a Thursday afternoon on a terrain platform, when he'd seen a woman standing alone among the wreckage of her plans and had chosen simply to stop. Nora took his hand. They went down the hill together toward whatever ordinary, extraordinary day was waiting for them at the bottom. And behind them, the September light lay gold and permanent on everything they'd built. And the mountains stood as they had always stood, enormous, indifferent, beautiful above a life that was none of those things, a life that was particular and chosen and entirely, completely theirs.